All right, everybody, welcome to what very well might be the most fun lecture of this entire semester. At least I'm very excited about it. We're going to be talking about Pirates of the Caribbean, and the crazy thing about it is that is the perfect title. And as we'll discuss shortly, this background here is not something out of a Disney movie. This is indeed a genuine pirate flag design. So, pirates have been around as long as there has been commerce on the seas, right? But today, we're going to be focusing on a particular group of pirates because they are such a good expression of both this expanding Atlantic world, the rise of nation states, how it related to, interacted with the rise of capitalism. But they're also the first time really in this course that we're going to zero in on some form of resistance. All this social change did not happen without anybody pushing back. And pirates, as it turns out, are an excellent example of people resisting these overwhelming changes in their lives. So today, we're going to be focusing on what historians refer to as the Golden Age of piracy. And the Golden Age of piracy lasted only about a decade. From 1716 to 1726 were the peak years. And these pirates were active primarily in the Caribbean, especially the Bahamas, which were effectively ungoverned by any national power. The islands of the Bahamas and the Caribbeans, basically no government was in charge there, and so that is where they rendezvoused. That was their base of operations. But the same pirates, the same group of people, were also active off the coast of the North American English colonies and also off the coast of Africa, especially the island of Madagascar, which is off the coast of East Africa, which for a while during this time period was also effectively a pirate island, like the Bahama Islands. All right, so how did piracy, this golden age of piracy, begin? Well, many pirates got their start working legally for England as privateers. You might have heard that phrase before. And privateers meant that they had royal permission. They were granted via a document known as a letter of marque. If you've ever seen Pirates of the Caribbean, the letters of marque come up at some point in the series, all three movies, I mean. And what these letters of marque did is they basically, and they were documents, they were literally letters, they were given to privateer captains, and they basically gave them permission to capture Spanish ships and plunder Spanish ships, because during a period from the late 17th into the early 18th century, England was on and off again at war with Spain. It was kind of a state of chronic warfare. And so they would give permission, right, to these privateers to go capture Spanish ships and share in the plunder of the captured Spanish ships. And this system worked for England because they did not have the manpower to constantly patrol Spanish-occupied areas in the New World, right? And they didn't have a ginormous fleet where there could be a British naval ship everywhere there might be Spanish ships in the seas, right? So they would give these licenses to privateers to do it for them. However, when war with Spain ended in 1713, many of these formally licensed privateers continued to capture Spanish ships, but they weren't supposed to anymore. Their letters of marque were revoked because that was part of the peace with Spain. So the sort of on-again and off-again war has a definitive end in 1713, and the English are like, okay, privateers, stop capturing and plundering Spanish ships. But some of those privateers are like, well, that's what I do for a living, so I'm going to do it anyways. Now, eventually, and often in retribution for the punishments meted out to their fellow pirates, many pirate crews began capturing English ships as well. And by the end of this golden age of piracy, it's completely common to capture English ships, which is why pirates were sometimes referred to as the villains of all nations, because they had no national loyalty, right? They didn't view themselves as dedicated or loyal citizens of any country, and that included England. Now, another major vehicle through which pirate crews were born during this period was through mutiny. The crew of a naval or merchant vessel would rebel and effectively throw out, right, their overseers and become a pirate crew. And then the other major vehicle was through crews of merchant and naval vessels that were captured by pirates joining the pirate crews that captured them after capture. Pirates always gave them an opportunity to join the pirate crew if they wanted, and many took them up on that offer. So who were these pirates? Almost to a man and a woman, pirates came from lower class backgrounds. All right, pirates were the lowest, the poorest of the poor in the 18th century Atlantic world. These were people with really thin to almost non-existent options on the ground. Age-wise, the vast majority were somewhere in their 20s. A pirate as old as, say, 50 was a very rare thing. Ethnically, most pirates came from somewhere in Great Britain, meaning either England, where almost half of the population of pirates came from, Scotland, Wales, and also Ireland. About 10% of pirates were Irish. Now, another roughly 25% came from somewhere else in the Americas, meaning the North American colonies or the West Indies. There also was a spattering of pirates from other regions of the world who appear to have not been counted as carefully as pirates of British origin. There's a couple reasons for that we'll touch on in a moment. But we know that there were pirates from several parts of Africa, from France, Portugal, and Sweden, just to name a few. In all likelihood, there were more African pirates than our records, our historical documentation shows. In fact, their numbers were probably in the hundreds. But they didn't tend to make it into official records because colonial authorities tended to sell African pirates into slavery when they were captured rather than to put them on trial. And so much of our documentation of who pirates were, how old they were, where they came from, comes from court records. So we end up without records of a lot of African pirates. And from other accounts that we can cobble together, sort of piece together, we get the general impression that their numbers were higher than we can officially declare. We also know that at least 6 Native Americans also went on the account, as becoming a pirate was called. On the account was the phrase they used to refer to those who were pirates. And finally, while there may have been more women pirates disguised as men or not captured by the historical record, we know that at least 3 women were full members of pirate crews, and we have a decent amount of information about 2 of them who we're going to talk about later in their lecture. But whatever their background, pirates were men of and women of the sea. Sailing was a highly skilled occupation. It was very, very, very poorly paid. So that's why, right, the poorest of the poor made up the majority, the vast majority, 99.9% of pirates. But it was a skilled occupation. And it wasn't something that anyone could take up on a whim. So people who became pirates had been sailing in deep sea voyages, right, across the Atlantic Ocean in all likelihood, since they were very young. By the time they went on the account, right, a lot of these young men had become sailors in their early teens, or even as young as 10 or 12. So these are people with a lot of experience with living life on the sea and understanding, right, what is required to make one of these intricate and amazing machines that was 18th century deep sea ships work, right? All right. Now, why, however, did pirates decide to do this very risky and highly illegal thing? I just mentioned how skilled their work was and how underpaid they were for it. And it was the treatment that they received for this work that most of them cited as their underlying reason for turning to piracy. Being an average sailor on either a naval or merchant ship was a brutal experience. The pay was pitiful, and it was unequally divided between common sailors, which made up the majority of the crew, and those with higher rank. The food was awful, often rotten, short on essentials like vegetables. Lots of sailors came down with scurvy, which occurs when you don't have enough vegetables for too long. And the food was also distributed unequally. So the captain and his officials, the superiors, would always have a much larger share of whatever food was available. And finally, disease could be rampant, and it was very difficult to escape when it broke out on a ship, right? If you have a highly contagious disease on a ship and you're in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, there's nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. So it's very hard conditions, and the discipline, finally, that was meted out to the common sailors by their superiors was extremely harsh and occasionally even murderous. People would die, for example, from whippings that they received. Altogether, this made for miserable conditions where common sailors were regularly abused and often malnourished. A common joke among sailors considering mutiny was that even if they failed and their superiors tried to hang them to punish them for the mutiny, the weight of their bodies would not be sufficient to break their necks because they were so malnourished. Not surprisingly then, perhaps, the final major source of new pirates were seamen who, when their ship, as I mentioned a moment ago, were captured by pirates, volunteered to join their crew. And as I'll also discuss in a few minutes, the pirate crews would always interview the sailors of ships that they captured and ask them how they were treated. Now, fortunately, the underlying motive for all seamen who turned pirate is not mysterious. For in addition to extensive documentation of these horrible conditions, we have their own words as to why they decided to go on the account. So I just want to emphasize here that I'm not just deducing, historians are not just deducing from the work conditions saying, well, obviously that must be why they became pirates. We know that because we do actually have extensive testimony, mostly collected in court documents when they are, asked to repent about why they made this decision to turn pirate. For example, one pirate, a man named William Fly, took the occasion of his own hanging to announce to the gathered crowds that had come there to see him executed that, quote, this is William Fly speaking, all masters of vessels might take warning by the fate of the captain that he had murdered, and to pay sailors their wages when due, and to treat them better. Their barbarity made so many turn pirates, end quote. So what is William Fly saying here? He's defiantly using this moment of his execution to let everyone know that if you don't want more people turning pirate like I did, you ought to treat your sailors and your men badly, and or better, excuse me. And they had an expression for this kind of abuse, bad usage. And they understood, or expressed, that it was their bad usage which they were rebelling against. Another little fun detail about William Fry's execution here: before he gave his defiant speech to the gathered crowds, he noticed that the man responsible for tying the knot in his noose was not doing it correctly. And he criticized him, or sort of made fun of him, for not knowing how to tie a proper knot, and then showed him how to do it correctly. So he actually literally tied his own noose before then giving this defiant speech to the crowd. Alright, so men who became pirates were men who were fully aware that they had been abused and exploited, and they explained their motives as stemming from a refusal to continue putting up with these conditions. As one contemporary explained, becoming a pirate was to go from plundering for others to do it for themselves. However, probably the greatest commentary on why pirates turned pirate came from how they recreated the environment, and you can say the government of the ship on their own pirate ships. First and foremost, booty, plunder, right, was divided nearly equally amongst all crew members, with skilled pirates in important positions receiving only slightly more. And everybody in a certain position would receive the same amount. So if you had a particularly vital role, you would, receive a fraction higher, but everybody who played that same role as you would receive that small fraction more. And this was agreed upon by everyone involved, how much everybody would get for what job. Also, the pirates who boarded a captured vessel, it was often referred to as a prize. I might use that phrase, a prize. That is a ship that you capture, and it refers to the ship and especially all the plunder and the booty on it. The pirates who boarded a prize would receive a slightly larger share as well, as opposed to the pirates who stayed on the ship, right? If you board a ship, somebody else has to stay on the ship you came from to make sure it doesn't float away or whatever. And the people who boarded the ship got a slightly bigger share because they took on a greater risk in the event that fighting broke out. One thing that is inaccurate in a lot of depictions of pirate life is that they did definitely have to fight sometimes, right? And violently take over a ship, but the majority of time, the terror that they produced in the minds of the sailors and the captain in charge of the prize was sufficient to where they would usually just surrender. Okay, so usually they would actually just surrender, and some pirates would board, but they were taking on a greater risk because sometimes they would say that they were surrendering, and then they would actually resist the pirates. So right, they took on a greater risk going on that boarded prize. Now, turns out a lot of crew members were so enthusiastic about taking on this extra risk, right, in order to get this extra share of the plunder, that almost everyone always volunteered to do it. So they divided the opportunity to board vessels equally as well, and they rotated between different groups of men so that everyone would have roughly the same number of opportunities to gain extra booty by putting themselves in more danger. So they're very minded that nobody accumulates a lot more booty or opportunity, right, to gain more booty than anyone else in any significant degree. Now, the rules that governed a crew reflected the same egalitarian impulse. Whenever a crew was created, the members of that crew would get together and write a set of rules and protocols, and these were called the Articles. And any man who wanted to be a captain to this new crew would have to agree to these articles. So this was something the common crew at large drew up, and then they handed to the person they had decided to let them be their captain, right? As a take it or leave it, right? You either agree to this and be a captain, or we go looking for a different captain. And the articles regulated everything from how booty was to be divided, to food and rum rations, to which punishments were appropriate for various violations. So the working conditions of a pirate ship were effectively under the control of the crew collectively. Moreover, as I just hinted at, the powers of the captain were extremely limited. Sometimes dramatic portrayals of pirates, even more recent and researched attempts like the TV series Black Sails, you may or may not be familiar with it, they continually get this wrong. All the major decisions of what a crew did was in control of the crew, which would vote on these decisions, even when it came to a question of whether or not to capture a vessel to gain a prize. The captain was trusted to make strategic decisions in the process of capturing or fighting, but otherwise he was kept on a very short leash. As one contemporary captain put it, quote, "They permit him to be captain on condition that they may be captain over him," end quote. If a captain abused his authority, violated the articles, he was disposed of, and occasionally particularly abusive captains were executed by the crew. So this is a very limited authority captains have. This is not the charismatic big man, right, that you see in so many pirate films, and as I mentioned in the TV series Black Sails, where everyone kind of just follows the lead of the captain. It's very, very different from that in real life, real historical life. Now, this limited authority also meant that the captain was given little to no social deference. He was treated like any other member on the crew. He received the same rations and food as the crew, and he did not even have a cabin to himself, right? You see again in these dramatic depictions the captain sort of retreating to his cabin and having it all to himself. Well, actually, everyone on a pirate ship hung out and slept wherever they pleased on the ship, and that included the captain's quarters, so he did not have that space to himself. As one historian has explained, quote, "The determined reorganization of space and privilege aboard the ship was crucial to the remaking of maritime social relations," end quote. In addition to this already very limited power of the captain, another key position, the quartermaster, played an absolutely essential role in the governance of a pirate crew. The quartermaster, like the captain, was elected by the crew, but he played the particular role of being the representative of the crew to the captain, the guy by his side, telling him what the crew is feeling, what the morale is, what their, grumblings are at all times. So, because you can't have a General Assembly Common Council meeting all the time. So the quartermaster was there to look after the interests of the crew and communicate them to the captain. So he represents the mood, the interests of the crew, and there was nothing that the captain could not take on without the approval of the quartermaster, whose job it was to gather information about what the crew wanted and how they were feeling. As one contemporary historian, meaning someone who was alive at the time, As one contemporary historian, someone who was writing this history at the same time, almost as it was happening, explained, quote, "The captain can undertake nothing which the quartermaster does not approve. We may say the quartermaster is a humble imitation of the Roman tribune of the people. He speaks for and looks after the interests of the crew," end quote. So the quartermaster was in charge of actually seeing to it that food and booty were distributed equally, right? He is making sure that the articles, right, of that particular crew are being followed. And this was a powerful position, and because of that, only the most trusted member of a crew, somebody who was loved and respected by everyone in that crew, only they would be elected as quartermaster. And in many ways, the quartermaster was more the leader of a pirate crew than the captain. And that is reflected not only in the great trust he was given, but also, for example, that he would be the first man to board a captured vessel or lead a crew into a fight. Again, not the captain, it was the quartermaster. However, even the quartermaster was subject to the ultimate source of power on a pirate ship, the Common Council. Simply put, the Common Council, which met regularly, included every single member of the crew. It's everybody. It's a general assembly, from the captain on down to the sailors with the absolutely most menial jobs. The council decided who did what, elected key positions like quartermaster and captain, and decided which course or prizes to pursue. So where are we going to go with this pirate vessel? Are we going to go to Africa? Are we going to go try to raid this island over here in the French Indies? What are we going to do? That stuff is in control of the Common Council. And neither a quartermaster nor a captain could overpower the Common Council. And if the Common Council became dissatisfied with either the quartermaster or the captain, they could vote him out of power and return him to the position of a common sailor. Consequently, as a contemporary of the time wrote, there was, quote, so little government and subordination among pirates that they are, on occasion, all captains, all leaders, end quote. Now, combined with a nearly equal distribution of booty, one historian therefore concludes, and now we're talking about a historian from the present day, that a pirate ship, quote, must have been one of the most egalitarian plans for the distribution of resources to be found anywhere in the early 18th century, end quote. So it's just this alternative world, all on its own on this ship. And of course, the one commodity perhaps more beloved than booty, booze, was also distributed equally. One thing pirate lore does get right is that pirates loved to drink. They loved to party. And indeed, they were so often drinking or drunk that, as one person wrote, being sober too often would bring, quote, a man under suspicion of being in a plot against the Commonwealth, end quote. The Commonwealth here meaning the pirate crew. And so they're basically saying that pirates who didn't drink on a regular and enthusiastic basis were looked at suspiciously because it was just weird. For some crew members, it was even clear that they cared more about continuous access to rum and liquor than they did about gaining wealth. We'll talk a little bit more about why that might be when I discuss their awareness of the probability of their imminent deaths. And as they loved to drink, pirates loved to party, or as it was called then, they loved to make merry. A pirate ship was the scene of constant singing, drinking, laughing, and dancing. One reason they were able to keep this up for so long, being sort of continuously drunk, is that pirate crews were generally much, much larger than merchant or naval vessels. And that meant that the amount of work that any one man had to do, right, in a given day or to finish a certain task was greatly less. So they kind of had a lot of time on their hands, so why not, right, have a drink or two or three or four or five or six. And of course, when they captured a vessel with plenty of booty and booze, a real party would break out. As a sailor was aboard a ship captured by pirates, explain the scene. This following quote is from a sailor who was on a ship that was captured by pirates. He said they, quote, hoisted from below decks a great many half hogshead of claret, which is wine, and French brandy. They promptly knocked their heads out and dipped cans and bowls in them to drink out of. As soon as these casks were empty, they hoisted up more. Soon they were throwing full buckets of claret and brandy on each other, and at the end of the day they washed the decks with what remained in the casks. So in case any of the 18th century English there didn't translate well, he's talking about how they brought up all the wine and the brandy first and used bowls to just dump it into these barrels and drink it out of bowls. And then when they had finished with all of that, they brought out the other stuff and were throwing it on all each other and basically having a big fun food fight with liquor. And they had so much they left even after all of that that they washed the decks of the ship with the rest of the booze. All right. They were no more restrained in their handling of bottled liquor. Quote, they would not give themselves the trouble of drawing the cork out, but nicked the bottles, as they called it, that is, struck their necks off with a cutlass, a sword, by which means 1 in 3 was generally broke. So pirates basically, they didn't bother trying to open a cork. They would just cut off the top with their swords and weren't worried about, the fact that they lost a whole bottle sometimes that way. In short, quote, they made such havoc of the bottled liquor that in a few days they had not one bottle left, end quote. Okay. Now, not surprisingly, all this partying sometimes had consequences. Fights could break out between drunken pirates, and occasionally they could end up in a wreck, or they could end up off course on their, direction on the ocean, since there was no one sober available to steer the ship. So, this is not without consequence. It could also interfere occasionally with battles. One attempt by the famous and the most successful pirate of the time period in terms of how many prizes he captured, one attempt by Bartholomew Robert to take a prize ended with them having to surrender. They failed to take it. But one drunk man, unaware of this fact, quote, came up on deck, vaporing with his cutlash, wanting to know who would go on board the prize. And it was some time before they could persuade him into the truth of their condition, end quote. So basically his pirate was too drunk to understand that they had lost the battle, and he came up from below decks and was all gung-ho, and it took them a while to explain to him that they had lost. Okay. However, despite all this crazy partying, the riotous nature of a pirate ship was not a thoughtless lifestyle decision on the part of the pirates. On the contrary, it reflected an awareness of the fact that as poor outlaws in the early 18th century, they were unlikely to live long lives. They would either die from a whole host of possibilities, right? Disease, violence, or they would get captured and executed. And consequently, they decided to enjoy themselves while they could. As one man contemplating joining a pirate crew put it to his fellow crew members, quote, they had better be dead than live in misery, end quote. Which, as I explained at the top of the lecture, was what life for these people mostly consisted of, misery. Pirates made a decision then to live life as they pleased while they could and try to soak some enjoyment out of it. A common saying among them was a merry life and a short one. As 2 other pirates put it, as they faced the crowd that came to see them hanged, they expressed no regret for what they did, but rather they declared a pirate's life to be the only life for a man of any spirit, end quote. So those were their words on the gallows facing their death. Perhaps nothing captures better the way pirates lived with an appreciation of life but an awareness of death than their flags. Either known as the Black, as in sailing under the black, or the Jolly Roger, and Roger, by the way, was slang for the devil, so it basically translates to the merry devil. Pirates used their flags as a form of terror, to intimidate, right, the prizes that the ships they were trying to capture into surrendering. And they also use them as a way to express the reality, right, of their lives. So we're going to look at a few of these. This one here is the flag, and this is a classic image you see all the time, right? And it, in fact, was the design of one of the most famous pirate captains, a man named Jack Rackham. Also a character in the TV show Black Sails, if you, again, happen to be familiar with it. So you had tons of imagery of skeletons and skulls, again, intended to both freak people out, right, and let them know you meant business, hence the swords here, right? But also, it reflected the fact that death was an ever-present reality in the lives of these pirates. So again, this is the most famous one. Not a skull and crossbones, but a skull and cross swords. But also extremely common that you do not see nearly as often is what pirates would call an anatomy, i.e. a full skeleton. So here we see one that you might have never seen before, and this is the flag of a pirate named Edward Lowe. And actually having some variation on a full skeleton was much more common. And this particular flag is supposed to represent Edward Lowe himself, who is the fleshy man, right? And a skeleton representing death. And together they're holding what you might think is a drink, which wouldn't be surprising, good guess, but is actually an hourglass. And what that symbolized, right, is, again, you're communicating to the crew you're about to try to capture their ship of that your time is up, right? Your time is short. Life is short. Death is coming for you. We are coming for you. You best surrender. But also reflected the transience, right? The shortness of life that pirates were constantly aware of, right? Again, they were very aware that they were unlikely to live very long, definitely not to a ripe old age. So this imagery of a full skeleton is very common. And then perhaps also one of the more weird and frightening, I think, flags was the flag of Edward Teach, who was also known as Blackbeard, known to legend and history as Blackbeard. And here, instead of a skeleton, we have the full anatomy, so to speak, of Satan. It's supposed to be Satan. And he is also holding a hourglass in his hand. So again, you see this hourglass that shows up on a lot of pirate flags. And he's holding a spear that's about to be pierced into a heart, and those little dots are supposed to be drops of blood. So again, common themes: death and the defiance of official values, right? If you have Satan on your flag, what are you saying? You're saying we don't give a bleep, right, about what the preacher and the governor and the king himself has to say about anything. We are rebels. We have embraced the dark side, right? And in replace of that, we have embraced rebellious values. And we're going to kill you, right? Which actually, as I'll explain in a moment, ended up often being more bluster than truth. But they certainly wanted crews to think that so that they would have a quick and easy surrender. Also, I want to conclude this section on flags by noting that even though some flags, like this one we saw here, right, oopsies, where'd it go, expressed the personality or even the particular grievances of particular pirate captains, they were usually drawn up collectively by the crew. So when a pirate crew formed, they would come together, and one of the first things they did was write their articles, write the rules, and then they would come together and design their flag together. So it was a bonding activity. You can think of it that way, coming up with what kind of black you were going to sail under. Okay, so in the event that pirates ended up neither dead nor able to continue pirating, pirates created for each other what essentially amounts to the idea behind modern social security systems, not just the United States, but just in general, social insurance, right? They would preserve portions of their plunder towards a common fund so that in the event that a pirate lost a limb or they lost their eyesight and so they could no longer pirate, they could retire, so to speak, okay, so that they would at least have some pleasure out the rest of their life since they could no longer be active members of a crew. For example, a pirate named Jeremiah Huggins, sounds like he came from Ireland probably, said that he was given, when he was injured, 14 gold pistols, 7.5 ounces of gold dust, 82 pieces of 8, and 17 ounces of bullion when he was wounded and could no longer pirate. Moreover, for those who were injured or disabled on the ship, they received the same rations and food and booty as everybody else. So handicapped people or who couldn't do as much work were not discriminated against. So this insurance system reflected a deep sense of loyalty that pirates felt toward one another. Again, unlike depictions in television and film, where pirate crews are so often at odds with one another or mortal enemies of one another, right? Think just about Pirates of the Caribbean, right? You have Jack Sparrow versus Barbossa, right? But in reality, pirate crews never attacked each other as crews. And rather, they recognized a shared community that they referred to as the Brethren of the Coast, and they would call each other Brother Pirate. Now, certainly there were conflicts between individual pirates, but when these conflicts grew too intense, the result would be for crews to split in two. Often the leader of one faction, say if a crew is really split over whether or not they're okay with the conduct of a captain, rather, that wasn't allowed to go on too long. You needed a lot of social cohesion to make pirate crews work. So usually one faction would split off from the crew and start a new crew. Right? They wouldn't all kill each other. They would just be like, okay, let's go our separate ways. And they would elect a new captain, right, the split off of this crew. And he would develop his own crew. But solidarity was much more common, so much so that a pirate crew might decide to enact revenge on a port or a naval vessel in retribution for the treatment of pirates from other crews. So they would actively defend each other, right? So if a naval expedition from England had captured a pirate ship and had hung all of the pirates in the square of Port Royal or what have you, another pirate crew would come and attack that port in retribution for the loss of who they really considered their brothers. The pirate community was therefore, as you might notice, a tight-knit one. Between the years of 1716 and 1726, we're really only talking about roughly 4,000 men and at least 2 women who sailed beneath the black. From cobbling together the sources we have, unfortunately, again, mostly from court documents, we can sketch this rough chart here you see on the left of how the various pirate crews in the Caribbean and the larger pirate world were connected. I don't know how well you can see this. It's a photograph I took on my smartphone from a book. But the names that are in bold are the captains which operated out of the Bahamas. And the names are all captains, so it's organized by captain crews here. And the dark gray lines indicate that these different people sailed in consort with one another. So, for example, different captains had once been on a crew together. The direct line means it's a direct descendant from one crew to another. If you are a fan of the TV series Black Sails, you might derive some satisfaction from noting that Charles Vane, Jack Rackham split off from Charles Vane's crew. So if you watch the TV series, you know that their fates are sort of linked, and indeed, right, the Jack Rackham's crew split off from Charles Vane crew for very different reasons than are in the TV show, but they got that part right. And then finally, the thin dots are connected through not a direct connection, but via having known the same people or having the same crew members on their ships. So this is a very tight-knit community. It's about 4,000 people over a decade. These are people who know each other, have fought together, have fought with one another, and have also defended each other, sometimes to the death. All right. Now, as you've probably noticed, however, almost everyone in this community was male, which is quite true. And although pirate crews were ethnically diverse, and there is no evidence that Black and African crew members were treated differently, nonetheless, pirate crews were not unwilling, usually, to participate in the slave trade when it happened to coincide with their search for plunder. So they would seize a slave vessel, right, a ship carrying slaves to the New World, and take it to the New World once they took it over and sell slaves. So that is a considerable check, right, on the extent to which they rejected the usual hierarchies in their society. So there were limits to their rejection, and they were overwhelmingly male. But we do know of at least 2 women pirates, and their names are Anne Bonny and Mary Read. We know of at least 3, but Anne Bonny and Mary Read are the only ones we really have any information on. Now, both started life as illegitimate children. So one of the reasons you have so few women pirates, right, is not only because pirates wanted it to be a boys' club, so to speak, for the most part, but also because women would just have far fewer opportunities, right? Women weren't people who sailed on ships. That was not work that they did. So it's not surprising that they both come from illegitimate backgrounds, meaning that their parents weren't legally married, because this would increase the probability, right, that they would become outcasts or reject social norms and social hierarchies in some ways, because in a sense they were always outcasts from as soon as they were born. Mary's background, Reed's background, appears to have been more working class than Anne Rogers. Rogers had a father who was a merchant in the New World, but she ended up turning pirate. Now, both, however, were members of Captain Jack Rackham's, or Calico Jack, right? We already saw his flag and talked a bit about him. As he was called, his nickname was Calico Jack. And Anne was his lover, but she was absolutely fierce and a full pirate in her own right. Now, according to sources, it appears that Anne and Mary were full members of their crew, and they fully embraced the pirate life. And you kind of see a bit of this, actually, in what Anne was reported to have said about the fate of Rackham when he faced the gallows. She said, quote, "She was sorry to see him there, but if he had fought like a man, he need not have been hanged like a dog," end quote. So what Anne Bonny was basically saying here about her lover is that if he had really fought like a man, he would have either not gotten captured or would have died as a man, i.e. in the heat of battle, rather than surrendering and getting hanged like a dog. So these are really badass women, right? As for the fate of Anne Bonny herself, she was scheduled to be executed, but she had her executed delayed because she was pregnant. But then, apparently, somehow escaped the noose, because there is no record of her execution being carried out. So who knows what became of Anne Bonny, but I think it's kind of nice to think that somehow she got out of there and went on living a fun life somewhere else. Mary Read, however, was not so fortunate, and she died in prison while she was awaiting her execution. These 2 pictures here, the one on the right is from the time period. It's from the first major historical work on pirates, that was released within a decade or two of the death of most piracy. And this one here on the left is, of course, a present-day reimagining of Anne Bonny, but I loved it so much that I wanted to share it with you. I think it captures her spirit well. She's a rebellious woman. Finally, although pirates had clearly and fully rejected the ethics of the wider society, for example, a common slogan among them was, quote, "Curse the king and all the higher powers," end quote. That did not mean that they did not have their own set of principles. And in fact, pirates were very scrupulous about what they considered to be the key quality in a person that they valued. And their word for that was honest. Honesty, or an honest man, basically, was a man who was fair and treated his sailors decently and treated his brothers decently. And pirates considered seriously whether or not the various opponents that they encountered counted as honest or not. So, for example, when they captured a vessel, they would interview the sailors on that ship about how they were treated, right? Whether it was a naval vessel or a private merchant vessel, right? How have your superiors been treating you? And if those sailors said, actually, he's a pretty good guy, he hasn't given us any bad usage, right? That was their phrase, bad usage. Pirates would oftentimes leave that man unmolested and allow him to sail back to safety once they had taken their plunder. And we know of at least one occasion that's well documented where, in fact, the sailors testified so much in favor of their captain, and in this particular case, some of the pirates themselves had sailed under this captain in the past, that they actually gave the captain his plunder back and sent him on his way. They basically said, sorry about that we tried to capture your vessel. Turns out you're a decent guy. We'll let you go. Okay. So these people are not nihilists, in other words, right? They are not irrationally or rapidly violent, no matter what. And in fact, right, the violence aspect of it is overplayed in most, again, film and TV depictions. They could be violent. However, I'm not trying to say that was an essential part of sort of their career, so to speak. Sometimes the opposite would happen. Sometimes they would capture a vessel with a captain known for abusing his sailors, and then sometimes pirates would even encounter their former masters, right, when they would capture their vessels. And in that case, his treatment was very unlikely to go well, and it could include torture and even murder. But again, they had an idea in their mind, right, of what deserved, who deserved that kind of treatment and who did not. And they stuck to it very consistently. And by the last years of the golden age of piracy, however, the violence tended to uptick, because by then, plunder was becoming less important and survival took precedence, because the campaign by England and other major powers to crush piracy had ratcheted it up several degrees. Earlier in the golden age of piracy, royal pardons were issued to try to get people to quit being pirates. Basically said, if you stop being a pirate now, we won't execute you. But they failed to eradicate piracy. So England then retook the Bahamas. A man by the name of Woodes Rogers became the governor there. And pirates were hunted down and hung in the hundreds. Entire crews could be hung at a time. So, aware that they were increasingly under attack, the pirate crews in these last years fought less for booty and more for survival. And as they did so, the fighting got more and more fierce, and they tended to make fewer and fewer exceptions, right? Because it was much more of a you go or I go mentality. Despite this attempt, though, by 1730, piracy was effectively wiped out. This depiction in the background here, kind of a romantic depiction, is of the death of Blackbeard, who did die in battle. Again, towards the end of the golden age of piracy, plunder, booty was almost a second thought. The pirate crews that remained understood that they were fighting for their very existence. So the violence on both sides went up considerably. All right. So, in conclusion, I would like to offer the view that the reality of pirates is one of the few cases where the legend or the myth of history actually turns out to be less interesting and even less inspiring than the truth. Pirates clung to one of the last opportunities in a world that was growing ever more connected and ever more controlled by the nation state, whether it be England or Spain or France. They clung to the chance to build an alternative society and live in opposition to the oppressive structures that they had labored in. As low-wage workers who rebelled against the power of nations and of this growing Leviathan, sorry, it took me a moment to find that word, of this growing Leviathan of capitalism in the state. They rebelled against that, and they rebelled against all of these conditions that were increasingly imposed upon all people of working class or lower class background. So they used their short lives to build a tradition and a memory of principled defiance, which still comes down to us today. And interestingly, you can see it resonate in how popular, right, myths, legends, movies, films of pirates are. But the beautiful thing is when you look at it more closely, it's even more inspiring. And I think that's a very rare thing, right? Usually you look closer at history and you get disillusioned. When it comes to pirates, you can find a lot of hope. I think, at least I do. All right, hope you enjoyed that lecture 1/4 as much as I did, and I will see you on the other side of this week.